I'd like to welcome you all to day 5 now of our online summer school. So thank you all for sticking with us so far. And we have a really interesting, really excellent program for you today. Our topic is immigration, and our first speaker and the faculty member and really the host of this afternoon is Sarah Fine from King's College London. And so without much delay, I'll ask Sarah to talk just in a moment. After Sarah's talk, there will be, of course, a question and answer session. And what I would like you to do, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And they will be fed to me and I will ask them on your behalf of Sarah. After Sarah's talk, we'll have a short break, and then we'll have 2 more sessions from Elaine Yim and Rufaida Al-Hashmi, and that will take us up until 5:30. After Elaine's talk and Rufaida's talk, Sarah will engage them both for a little while, and then we'll also have Q&A after that point. So let me hand over to Sarah. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm really delighted to be speaking with you. Thank you so much to Professor Wolf, to Joe, for organising this fantastic workshop, this fantastic summer school. I've been so impressed with the quality so far, and I'm really excited for this afternoon's session. It's, again, an honour to be on a panel with Elaine and Rufaida, and I'm looking forward to hearing their talks. So as Joe mentioned, he's asked me to speak about immigration, and obviously that's a huge topic. So my way in to this theme is to think through some challenges of doing philosophical work on migration. I'm going to mention 5 challenges in particular. And I should stress right away that this list is not exhaustive. There are many challenges of doing philosophical work on migration. And I also want to add that I'm not thinking of these challenges as exclusive to philosophical work on migration or unique to philosophical work on migration. Many of these challenges will apply in similar ways to the other themes that we've been discussing so far in the summer school, and it'd be interesting to think through the parallels. So I'll just mention briefly the 5 different challenges, and then I'll expand on them. Some of them really exercise me greatly, really trouble me, really concern me. Others of them less so, and I'll discuss why. So the 5 challenges that I'm going to discuss are the question, why is this philosophically interesting? Or in other words, how is this philosophy? Then the second challenge is, well, what's the point of doing philosophical work on this subject? The third is the question of whether or not we can write about migration with the required so-called critical distance. The fourth is related to the sensitivity and salience of the subject. And then the 5th focuses on the question of who are we as researchers. So I'll say a little bit more about each of the 5. Right, so the first challenge I mentioned is the question, why is this theme philosophically interesting? Why is it worthy of philosophical analysis? And now, when people work on migration in philosophy, I think it's fairly accepted that this is a topic that's worthy of philosophical analysis, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years. Work on this subject has blossomed, has flourished. It's now considered a key topic within political philosophy. And that has changed a lot since I first started working on this subject. Joseph Cairns, for example, has talked about the challenges that he faced getting his article, Aliens and Citizens, The Case for Open Borders, published in the first place. And Philip Cole, who's also another pioneer of this area of the ethics of migration, has spoken about having a response from a journal to one of his submissions on the ethics of migration, said something along the lines of, why is this philosophically interesting? So Whereas now I think we kind of encounter that kind of broad question, why is this philosophically interesting? How is this philosophy about the subject of migration in general? It's certainly true that we get this question in various ways, in different shapes and forms, when it comes to various areas, various questions that we might ask. And so what that question is asking us to do really is to sort of justify ourselves, to say, well, how does this work fit within philosophy? And then the temptation is to sort of go on the defensive and to say, well, look, I'm using familiar tools, I'm drawing on familiar methods, I'm talking about familiar traditions and authors and concepts. And to try to just kind of answer that question on the terms of the questioner. So there's more to be said here about the ways in which we kind of get disciplined into our disciplines. We're sort of pushed to work within familiar boundaries. And that's a real challenge and can be a real challenge for this kind of work. And there are a lot of pitfalls because one of the things that many people who are working on the philosophy of migration are trying to do is actually push at those boundaries, trying to challenge those boundaries, trying to cross them, very appropriately for the subject matter. So in that temptation to say, yes, what I'm doing really is philosophy, let me show you why it's familiar, we might actually be doing ourselves a disservice. And in fact, we might find ourselves falling into some of the what we might call pathologies of the professional discipline, rather than trying to highlight those very pathologies. So I think often people find when they're working on the philosophy of migration that we're being encouraged to fit into a particular mold. And it's difficult to kind of push through that and say, no, I can break the mold. I can do things differently. I can draw on different literatures. I can draw on poetry. I can draw on different disciplines in interesting and important ways, for instance. So there's that sort of challenge. And I think that comes up a lot. The second challenge that I mentioned is the question of, well, if migration is so important, if you really care about this topic, if it's so significant and crucial right now, well, then why do philosophical work on it rather than something more world-changing? Why not say be an activist instead, or go directly into politics? And that question could be a sort of general one. Well, why not do something different altogether? Or it can be focused a bit more on the sorts of questions or sorts of issues that somebody's discussing. So somebody might say, well, look, if this is such a pressing issue, why not focus on real practical questions that affect people's day-to-day lives, rather than sort of more abstract questions or what look like more foundational questions about something like a human right to international freedom of movement? Why not focus more on the day-to-day issues? And these sorts of questions really have exercised me quite a lot. You know, that is something that comes up quite often, particularly when talking about grave injustices that people face through the control of migration. And I've thought about this, and I really do think that philosophical work on this topic is crucial. It can be deeply informative, and it can be part of a project challenging contemporary injustices. So, for example, I think if we take something like challenges to the idea that states have something like a moral right to exclude, something we'll be discussing a bit more with Elaine later on. Why is that such an important thing to be engaging with? Well, I think a lot of people just automatically assume that states do have something like a right to exclude, and the sort of injustices that we see around the United States right now, in the UK and so on, that those are sort of not really business as usual, that those are, like I said, kind of pathologies. Whereas what we can do by highlighting work on the right to exclude is to show how the right to exclude is sort of fundamental to all those different sorts of unjust practices, that the right to exclude is at the center of these issues. So when we assume that states have something like a right to control migration, even if people also assume at the same time that that doesn't really capture refugees, that there are special rights that refugees have. No, actually, what happens is we see a system in which states claim for themselves the right to control the movement of people, and that refugees get very much caught up in that, and that states do everything in their power to control irregular migration, including the movement of refugees and so on. So the whole system of deportation, detention, pushbacks, and so on is all connected in some way to this idea that states have a right at base to control migration across their borders. So what philosophers can do is really question the legitimacy of that idea. And that's something Elaine does really beautifully in her paper, and we'll talk about that a bit more. Okay, so I think philosophical work on that is crucial, and I would really push back against the idea that it's just sort of navel gazing, or it's not really important right now. There are far more important issues. That's at the base. That's at the base of so many of these problems. So I don't think we should underestimate the value of philosophical work on this subject. However, then there's a sort of temptation to overestimate the value of philosophical work, to overestimate philosophy's place in these questions. We can be part of something, we can combine this beautifully with other ways of sharing ideas and other ways of pushing beyond boundaries, but it doesn't mean that philosophical work is everything. And we need to think about ways of working in interdisciplinary fashion, taking seriously the work of people in other disciplines, people with first-hand experience. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. I found it very interesting, actually. I've done quite a lot of work in recent years with people in the arts. So I've been working with a theatre company to create a play about migration restrictions, about the ethics of migration restrictions. I've worked with a choreographer on a dance about displacement and about maps and borders. And it's been really interesting to me the way in which philosophical ideas can feed into those sorts of projects, but the communication of those ideas can be quite different and can have quite a different audience and quite a different way of communicating with an audience. So one problem that we might find sometimes as philosophers when we're thinking about migration is that our mode of discussing things is ordinarily in the form of an argument. And that can be received sometimes as quite adversarial, as quite combative. It can mean that people who don't share our position sort of shut down or decide not to listen or think that they're not being listened to. But there's another way of communicating those ideas, for example, through dance, through theatre and so on, that can be more welcoming, more open, more accessible. The same ideas, but communicated in different fashions. So there are ways in which these ideas, this philosophical work, can have value even outside of the discipline of philosophy itself, and even outside of the norms of philosophical communication. Okay, so I want to argue that, of course, philosophical work on this is really important, but we can be humble, we can be modest, we can interact with other ways of thinking about these themes. Now, sometimes we get a third kind of challenge, a third kind of question, which is, well, if you're so sort of passionate about this topic, or if you feel kind of quite implicated in it, or if you feel like a kind of activist about these questions, then can you really be sufficiently detached from the subject to write about it with the kind of required critical distance? Can you really write as a sort of impartial researcher? And some of you may be familiar with Bas van der Vossen's work on this kind of question. You know, he argues that we have a moral responsibility to avoid engaging in the kind of political activism that might affect our ability as philosophers to seek the truth. And that we're affected by these political affiliations and projects of ours and so on. Our thinking is biased by them. We fall into various traps. We stop evaluating evidence in an impartial way if it already seems to confirm our existing beliefs, or we we take an interest in our particular in-group. We like being a member of this in-group. We like the people who are part of it. And we don't assess their views with the relevant level of impartiality and so on. Now, I'm less exercised by this kind of challenge, by this kind of worry. I think it's important to be aware of these cognitive biases and challenges, to be honest about them, to be open to learning from people. But at the same time, I think being aware of the biases goes some distance to addressing this kind of problem. And I'll be very happy to discuss this in more detail in the Q&A. But I have a sense that that kind of way of thinking about the project of political philosophy privileges particular kinds of social situations. I think it suggests that a lot of the work that we do isn't autobiographical, whereas in my sense, actually, a lot of the work that we do is autobiographical in various ways. We are committed, we are implicated, and that's okay. And that can be interesting, and that can be exciting, and it can be something that we can interrogate and that we can highlight and we can think about in more detail. Okay, a fourth challenge, again, one that does worry me, that does concern me, is that now is a time where migration, refugee, asylum issues have risen to alarming levels of global political salience. And as I've said in a recent article on refugees and the limits of philosophy, we know that the rights of refugees and migrants are under scrutiny and attack across the world. We can just take the example of the US, where President Trump's administration has been accused of waging war on refugees by erecting ever more barriers to people in search of asylum. And the salience and the sensitivity of this issue gives us pause, because even though we know that we're not in control of and can't necessarily anticipate what's going to happen to our research once it's out there in the public domain, we do know that this is a profoundly sensitive moment for philosophical reflection on the ethics of migration. And Jeremy Waldron has said that this kind of delicate timing brings into play a certain duty of care on the part of the moral critic. So that he says there's a kind of price of relevance. If we want to write about things that are deeply relevant, that are salient right now, we've got to be very careful. We've got to think about the kind of ethics of moral criticism. So I think that's very important. What does that mean? Well, it means that we should think very carefully about the sorts of questions that we're asking and the kind of answers that we're willing to offer. And I think there are some questions perhaps that we shouldn't think about answering, perhaps because they might contribute or feed into divisive political rhetoric. They might be used to prop up harmful policies. So I think we've got to be very sensitive and careful about the sensitivity of the subject. We know that, for example, seeking asylum is fraught with danger. It's life or death. Thousands of people die every year along migratory routes. People are imprisoned in detention centres, coercively separated from their families, subjected to violence and intimidation from law enforcement officers. So the answers to these questions can have serious implications for the safety of real people. So that, I think, is a serious challenge that we need to engage with. It's a difficult issue, and it's one that I'd be very happy to hear more about your thoughts. Okay, so the final issue that I want to raise, the final challenge that I think we all face as philosophers working on the subject of migration is the question of who are we? Who are we doing the writing? Who are we taking up the space? Who are the dominant voices? Who are the people who are heard? And there's been a lot of work in recent years in political philosophy and political theory around methodological questions. And there's been a lot of discussion of that already in the summer schools so far. Joe's talked a lot about non-ideal and ideal theory, for example. So there are a lot of questions about for example, the relationship between political philosophy and real world politics. There are questions about, you know, what sort of work should we be reading? Who is the audience? Should we be focusing on these questions or those questions, and so on? But I think not enough attention has gone into another methodological question, which is, who are we? Who are the researchers? Is the who kind of question. And as Jason was saying yesterday, you know, here, critical philosophers of race, feminist philosophers have led the way. So it's been fascinating for me as somebody working on the subject of migration, that very often invited to, say, a conference or a workshop about refugees, and none of the speakers have a refugee background, or none of the speakers are from countries which host the vast majority of the world's refugees, or none of the speakers, for example, are from the global south, and so on. There seems to be a sense that it's fine just to hear from a very limited set of voices. And I think that's really problematic. I think we've been very late to catch up on the sort of disability rights activist slogan, you know, nothing about us without us. Why is it so important to hear from refugees, to hear from key stakeholders? Well, lots of reasons. I mean, for example, it seems deeply problematic that refugees are excluded from the conversation, that they lack voice and participation in matters that so deeply concern them. So there's the problem of the exclusion of these voices and what that means for refugee agency and so on. There's also the way in which we can miss out on certain concerns, certain questions, and only answer very specific questions or foreground very specific questions that are the preserve of people from certain countries. So for example, you know, a lot of the work within political philosophy on refugees is focused on questions like, who should share in the so-called burden of resettling refugees, rather than focusing on questions that come directly from refugees themselves. It can also mean that there are misunderstandings and misrepresentations within the literature about the experience of refugees, about the best sort of response to the predicament of refugees. And it's not just refugees themselves and people with first-hand experience of being refugees or having refugee crises within their local communities and so on that we need to take account of, but also researchers from other disciplines who have a great deal of expertise in these sorts of questions, journalists, people living in the countries hosting large numbers of refugees and so on. A lot of those voices are currently excluded from the conversation or are not given sufficient space and weight in the conversation. So those are some of the issues that I've been thinking about in relation to the philosophical challenges, or the challenges for philosophers working on this subject. Now, all that said, there is lots of brilliant, exciting, important work being done on the topic, and people are navigating these challenges in expert ways. And I think people who are working on the ethics of migration are learning a lot, as I said, from feminist philosophers, critical philosophers of race, and broader traditions of thought. So the message is, yes, philosophical work on migration is deeply important, let's do it, but let's be mindful of the challenges that I mentioned. Let's be mindful of our limits. Let's be mindful of what various voices and participants can offer to this conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. And you can't see the audience, you can only see me, but I will give a round of applause on behalf of everyone. So let me encourage those people who want to ask questions to do so by putting your questions into the Q&A. I found it a fascinating talk, and so many things that I personally would like to take up. One thing I've been thinking about myself lately is the standpoints that people take and the sources of evidence they draw on. Because I did a little bit of work on ethics of immigration, and coming at it from an outsider, first thing you want to do is find out the facts. So, for example, does immigration lead to rising unemployment or falling unemployment? And every paper cites a study that confirms their view here. So I wonder what you felt. You raise this under, I think, the third heading, how do you get a critical distance? Presumably everyone working on this topic starts with a view, and they're looking for the studies that confirm their own position. Is there any way of guarding against that?
Yeah, that's such a difficult question, isn't it? I mean, I think the problem actually goes a bit deeper, because I think what tends to happen with philosophical work on migration isn't even so much that people just cite the studies that seem to confirm their existing assumptions and so on, but rather they look to other philosophical work that cites the relevant studies. Those studies could be completely out of date. They could be thoroughly discredited within their own discipline, for instance, but they just sort of stick around in the philosophical literature, in the philosophical imagination. And I think there are some political philosophers who've done brilliant work on just these sorts of issues. So, for example, Kieran Oberman has done some really important work on the ethics of emigration, thinking about questions related to brain drain. Because there seems to be just this general assumption among political philosophers that, well, let's not get too excited about the justice potential of open borders, because in all likelihood, what will happen is that that's going to further disadvantage the world's least advantaged, i.e., those people in countries that already have, for example, poor healthcare systems, where people will want to leave en masse to experience the great opportunities in wealthier countries and so on. So that's going to leave the world's least well off even worse off. And yet development economists have been pushing against that idea for a very long time. And Kieran Oberman has done great work sort of citing the latest research on that topic to show the ways in which the conversation has moved in the empirical literature, has moved along in the, whatever it is, the 13 years since the study that everybody in the political philosophy literature cites. Even people who come at this from a critical angle and who want to say, hey, philosophers, spend much more time engaging with the social science and with the expertise and so on, often fall into that same trap of just assuming that the cause of global justice won't be served by open borders, because obviously the least well off will suffer the most, and so on. So I think it's not just that we look for the studies that already confirm what we think. It's that we probably don't do enough of the research that we need to do. That is really, really difficult, because, as we know, it's hard enough to feel like we've got mastery of our own little area on which we're writing a small paper. But to feel like we've got mastery of a subject that's quite far beyond our area of expertise, particularly methodologically, is a serious challenge. Many of us suffer from being time poor, especially those of us who are enduring a pandemic with zero childcare, plenty of us here. So the challenges are great. But I think a lot of this can be mitigated in certain ways by being modest and humble about what we can do as philosophers, about what we can say that is definitive. And I think it's really useful to think of ourselves as contributing to a wider conversation. I know you've got some great stories, Joe, about the ways in which philosophers can kind of inflate the role of philosophy when it comes to certain important normative questions. But I think it is deeply important to listen to expertise in other areas and to try to stay abreast of that kind of work. It does mean that that work can be quite slow, it can be quite painstaking, it can be really, really difficult, but I think that it is deeply important.
That's fantastic, thank you. So there's some points there you make, I think, which are very important to anyone who is doing or thinking of doing interdisciplinary research. So one is, I think, implicitly, so that other fields move faster than philosophy. And so the research you do at the beginning of the reading you do at the beginning of your research is probably out of date by the time you come to send it off to publishing, so you have to do it again. The second is that other fields are as controversial as philosophy, so you can't just read one. It's like someone wanting to know what's the position in philosophy of mind and reading one paper and thinking they've understood it. So I think the solution to this is talking to people, actually. Rather than just doing a Google search and reading, find an expert, find someone in the subject area and get them to tell you about what the controversies are and what's new, rather than thinking as an untrained researcher in another area, we can somehow pick this up for ourselves. Anyway, I've dominated this for too long. We've got a lot of questions. So let me take a question first from David Ellitzer. What would you make of flipping around the premise of the question of engaging in refugee advocacy? If we accept that it's indeed appropriate for political philosophy to engage in refugee advocacy, is there an argument to be made that, given the field's unique outlook, political philosophy should engage in refugee advocacy? Have I got that right? If we accept it's
incumbent on us to do it because
I see.
Of the kind of thing. Yeah. Is that the idea, David?
I think that's right.
Great. I'm really sympathetic to that idea. I think that's a fantastic point. I always want to be cautious about the potential for making things worse. So just as Joe was saying about listening to experts in, say, economics, the field of development, law, similarly, I think it's really important for philosophers to take their cue from, say, activists who are working in this area. I came at philosophy from probably quite an unusual angle, but an angle that many of you will have come from social and political sciences. So I started out in social and political sciences, and studying politics and the history of political thought, one of the main things that that was kind of impressed upon us again and again is the way in which politics is a realm of unintended consequences. And I think that's something for philosophers to take extremely seriously. So I think, for example, and this is something that I tried to press in the paper that I suggested as recommended reading for this session, that we might think, oh, hey, I've got a really well thought through definition of a refugee. And I think it ticks all these kind of important boxes. And I think it's much more expansive and inclusive than the convention definition of a refugee. But actually, it might be that if people take seriously that sort of definition, it's going to have a whole series of unintended consequences. For instance, given that refugees have a certain kind of privileged position in the movement stakes, if refugees are defined in a certain way, those who fall outside of the definition and who therefore don't have entitlements to those special claims and rights and so on, may be forced to move into kind of clandestine routes. So there might be all sorts of intended consequences of a particular way of redefining something. So similarly with refugee activism, I think we've got to be very mindful of the problem of politics and unintended consequences. But I really like David's point, and I think that's a really nice way of moving forward with this challenge about the relationship between philosophy and activism.
Okay, thank you. And a question from Katie Tyner. Thank you for your talk. Excuse me. Do you think that academic disciplines are increasingly narrowing or widening? In other words, do you see academia becoming more or less open to interdisciplinary work and to research questions that lie outside of the traditional scope?
That's a great question, Katie. So I'm going to speak from my own experience here, because I think it's very difficult to answer that beyond my own experience. And of course, I mean, this is one of the things I was trying to highlight, is the difficulty of generalizing from one's own experience, which might be quite idiosyncratic, quite niche. But in my experience as somebody working in British academia, you find this tension all the time. Maybe Joe will back me up here, Rafida can back me up here, that there's a lot of funding for interdisciplinary activity, and there's a lot of sort of political support, nominally at least, for interdisciplinary activity. It's kind of a buzzword. So when people are writing their grant applications, they probably throw the word interdisciplinarity in, 5 or 6 times in the first paragraph, because it's considered to be something that funding bodies like, for instance. And yet at the same time, there's this push towards disciplinarity, towards sticking within the confines of your own discipline. So we have something called the Research Excellence Framework, which I think really suffers from that tension. Even though it's trying to kind of make space for interdisciplinary work, I think it really struggles to do that for all sorts of reasons. Are disciplines becoming narrower? Well, a lot of people talk about how they're becoming more professionalized, and that comes with certain pathologies. So I think it can be really tricky. I think if you're doing interdisciplinary work, you often come up against the problem that I mentioned right at the beginning, that people might not quite understand exactly what it is you're doing, and they try to push you in this direction or that direction, and you end up sort of straying from your original goal because you're trying to justify the value of the project, or you end up being kind of disciplined into citing and reading certain papers that are very much within your own discipline, and kind of moving away from your original goal of bringing in far more. And there can be the challenge, there can be various challenges of working across disciplines. So for example, what might seem really novel and path-breaking to us as philosophers or political theorists might seem sort of 25 years old to somebody working in social theory or anthropology. Jason was mentioning yesterday, that anthropologists pick him up on his conception of culture and so on. So some of these, some of what seems really exciting and important to us here might seem quite out of date. There's that challenge for one, and I suppose there's another challenge of speaking the languages of different disciplines, of trying to explain what's relevant, why it's relevant, why it's important. But I myself am a huge fan and defender of interdisciplinary work. I think if you work on certain topics, you're sort of nudged into interdisciplinarity anyway. I mean, I think we saw from Colleen's presentation that it'd be very difficult to work on something like transitional justice without taking very seriously historical research on this topic, political science research on this topic, and of course, legal theory and so on. So a lot of the questions that we're engaging with are by their very nature demanding interdisciplinary work. So I'm all in favor of kind of fighting against this demand to show that what we're doing is true philosophy. I mean, I think Christy Dotson's paper, How is this paper philosophy, should be required reading for everybody studying philosophy, and certainly everybody doing these kind of funding appraisals and being on research excellence framework panels and so on, because it's all about the way in which certain questions are nudged out of philosophy, or certain topics are kind of forced into a sort of justifying framework, and have to spend all the time explaining why what they're doing is relevant and satisfactory, and always being on the defensive. And this has another effect, which is to push certain people with certain concerns and certain interests out of the discipline altogether.
Well, that certainly happens. I think probably you've had the same experience of very good undergraduates thinking they want to do research, yet philosophy is not the discipline for them. And so going to anthropology or psychology, even political science, to pursue their questions, which they really feel are philosophical questions, but haven't been validated within the discipline in the same way. But let's move on to the next question, which is from Adriana Matos, who says, can you comment on the connection between the discussion about migration and refugees and the debate about reparation and restitution, in the sense that a lot of the problems that cause migration are caused by years and years of colonialism?
Yeah, great question. Absolutely. So this was something that did really exercise me in my early work on this topic, and I think that's so important. So, you know, when I first started working on the right to exclude, for instance, I was fascinated by the way in which people tended to treat questions of racism, historical injustice, and so on, just to sort of write them out of the equation altogether by saying, well, let's just assume from the beginning that any kind of legitimate immigration policy is going to be one that doesn't select between candidates for admission on grounds of, say, race or ethnicity, or let's just assume from the start that we're talking about states defined in certain ways. We can talk more about that when we discuss Elaine's paper on self-determination and collective autonomy, because there are really interesting issues there. So I was really fascinated at the way in which the starting point sort of assumed away various of the key injustices that we're thoroughly aware of in this whole pursuit of controlling migration across borders. And of course, these themes are well known from work in critical philosophy of race, colonialism, historical injustice, but the two literatures were not kind of coming together in the ethics of migration. I mean, I think that part of the reason why that's the case is that early work in the ethics of migration just had to do so much of that justificatory work that I was talking about, kind of saying, hey, look, we fit in this tradition too. We can talk about rules, we can talk about Nozick. This is really political philosophy, and let's talk about that. But also that a lot of the early work on the ethics of migration came through a sort of liberal nationalist communitarian tradition that made certain assumptions about the ethics of nationality and so on. So I think that really that this is the space, this is where the action ought to be, really thinking through what the demands for reparation, trying to redress some of these injustices might mean now. So I think, as I'll discuss with Elaine in a little while, you know, assuming that, for example, all not that Elaine is doing this, I should say, but that any assumption that all non-citizens sort of have exactly the same relationship to the so-called receiving state is obviously deeply problematic, because, you know, some so-called non-citizens might be former colonial subjects and so on. So we need to really, really think about the starting points. We really need to think about some of the questions that Tommy was dealing with. You know, are the kind of institutions that we're talking about ones that can kind of be reformed in a way that takes account of these sorts of questions, or do we need to push towards something more like abolition? So yeah, I think this is exactly a very fertile and important site for work on the ethics of migration.
Thanks so much. So we have two questions that I think not identical, but there's a certain overlap. So I'll read both of the questions, Sarah, and then you can take them together. The first one is from Abdu Al-Rashid Tangol, who says, apart from the questions on exclusion and the need to include the voices of refugees, those from the global south, those from other disciplines, etc., another issue I noticed is that refugees, migrants, internally displaced persons, etc., may also suffer from research fatigue. In my experience, this becomes more evident in cases where research does not lead to interventions or any tangible change in the lives of these vulnerable groups. Do you think this is an important concern that researchers should be paying more attention to? And then from Katerina, we have, thank you, Professor Sarah, fantastic talk. Here's my question. How can we include underrepresented voices in our philosophical conversations without instrumentalizing them, e.g. using their voices as a way to improve our work, but without benefits for their life? So I think there is a connection between those two.
Such good questions. Again, really difficult, important challenges. Yeah. So I mentioned in the paper that I suggested as reading for the session, I mentioned Elizabeth Spellman's work on exploiting the suffering of others, on the worries around sort of using other people's experiences and particularly their suffering for our own gain. So exactly as the second question was mentioning, sort of instrumentalizing them rather than allowing people to be the kind of subjects of their own lives. And I think it really is important that, you know, the same people are being called up by pollsters or are being asked to give their views by, you know, Oxfam and so on, again and again, when really that might not be their ultimate, you know, their immediate concern. So I think a lot more work needs to be done on the area of possibly the difference between sort of straightforward including voices and moving towards more kind of participation that actually foregrounds refugees themselves in the projects. There are all sorts of ways in which I think we can draw on the experiences of refugees that isn't kind of instrumentalizing and isn't exploitative. So for example, you know, we can think of philosophers who've published who themselves are have refugee backgrounds and who've written about that. I mentioned, you know, Hannah Arendt, I mentioned Isaiah Berlin. You know, there are lots of examples of philosophers, political theorists and so on who've had those sorts of backgrounds, who've talked about it. And I think there are ways of, you know, it doesn't have to be necessarily just going around and asking people questions, but reading the first-hand accounts of people who've offered them up. You know, so for example, thinking about Behrooz Bookhani, who was detained in Manus Island. You know, he wrote this incredible book about his experiences. So reading those kinds of accounts and thinking about what we can learn from them, so that we don't have to kind of keep going around and surveying people. But I think both of those questions point to something really, really important, which is that it can be very easy to say, oh, well, let's listen to the voices of refugees, but that comes with its own serious questions about research ethics and so on. And again, I think research ethics is something that probably philosophers don't think about enough. So whenever I'm engaged in an interdisciplinary project around working with refugees, you know, the first thing that's mentioned is, you know, we need to get research ethics clearance for these sorts of questions. And I think that's something that we philosophers could consider a lot more.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is from Katarzyna, who says, thank you for your presentation. I find it very moving. What I wanted to say is a reflection rather than a question, really. Your paper finishes with this touching quote: I will try to cross the border until I can be a human being again. I keep wondering how to convince our privileged societies to see humanity in those we should surround with humanitarian help and see beyond the monetary and economic means. So that is a question. How do we do that?
Yeah, so important. Yeah, so I mean, as philosophers, I think the sort that we've been discussing can try to do that sort of thing. I think that, you know, we can support other ways of promoting that kind of message through documentaries, for example. I think it's important to consider, this is a new project of mine that I'm working on, the ways in which refugees are presented in imagery, for instance. I think you see a lot of photographs of refugees presented as sort of huddled masses, intense, bearing burdens and so on, which kind of others there. gives the impression that there's something other, they're completely different from the rest of the population, rather than showing refugees as empowered, as agents in their own rights, as in control of their own, as people who have a voice and who can participate and who can be key stakeholders in the institutions that are going to affect them deeply. So I think that's something we philosophers need to think about as well when we're doing things like selecting covers for our books or selecting images for our slides. How are we representing refugees? Are we sort of showing, as you say, the humanity of people, or are we kind of recreating this notion of refugees as somehow just simply victims, or the other side of that as somehow violent, as security threats, as people who are dangerous? So I think we're all sorts of doing it, but again, philosophy, we're not our own here. We can work with us to do that productively.
It's fascinating. So, and even the language. So if you have a picture of refugees, that would be one thing. If you have a picture of emigres, you can imagine them sitting outside a cafe, having an intellectual conversation. So that, and you'd have quite a different photo on the book if you just choose a different word. Okay, so Natalie asks, can you tell us about some of the ways that Challenge 5 has been answered? Do you have some positive examples of ways migrant and refugee voices have been centered in philosophy?
Sorry, Joe, lost you a bit there. Did you, ways in which Challenge 5 has been answered?
Yeah, you can see it in the chat as well. Do you have some positive examples of the ways migrant and refugee voices have been centered in philosophy? Yeah,
great question. Yeah, I think Kerry Woods in Leeds is a political theorist there, and Phil are doing really exciting work on this, as Clara Sanderland, who's currently at Sheffield, moving to Manchester. Really important, interesting work on foregrounding participation, the voices, the testimony, and so on, and stories of refugees, and thinking about that question about research fatigue and mentalizing stories of refugees. I think we can all try to model this in our own behavior. You know, if you're organizing a conference, if you're organizing a panel, to try to make sure that people who can speak from experience, who are experts by experience, for instance. So I try to do this in my role as a fellow at the Forum for Philosophy. That's an institution that tries to do kind of public communication of philosophical ideas across different disciplines with practitioners and so on. So for example, if we're speaking about the subject of immigration detention, it's really important to have a so-called expert by experience who can talk about what it's really like. And then it's not just, you know, it mustn't just be, you know, making up the numbers or, you know, being or tokenistic. It must be about taking very seriously the lens that can be learned from expert by experience, the way which the conversation, questions and so on benefit from listening to people who know what it's like to be on the receiving end of the kind of brutal treatment that states mete out to people who are considered irregular migrants.
Okay, so we have some questions that may have been uncovered, but let me take one from Rebecca Buxton. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for such a great talk. I wondered if you could comment on the growing role of field work in political philosophy and migration. I'm thinking particularly of Molly Gerver's recent work on repatriation, which includes interviews with many forced migrants. Do you think this is a way to work through some of the problems that you've raised?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a brilliant example, really important what Molly Gerver has done. And I think that requires a certain level of expertise, or at least being open to building expertise in those kind of areas, learning how to conduct those kinds of interviews, how not to just sort of go in there with certain assumptions, demands, objectives, and so on. And Molly has wonderful expertise on this issue, working with organizations that have expertise in that area. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think got this challenge with those who work on this to decide where we want to position ourselves. You know, how do we want to spend our time? How do we think we can best share our ideas? We can best support our arguments and so on. Some of us have certain sorts of skills. Some of us have. So I don't want that everyone has to go there and become fully trained scientists. I don't want to suggest that everybody has to do the sort of work that I'm talking about. Obviously, I'm kind of promoting this sort of thing because it's what I'm interested in. But it's perfectly legitimate for people to have different ways of engaging with these kinds of questions. I think, nonetheless, it's always going to remain important to be mindful of those challenges that I've mentioned and how we should address them. I don't think we have been mindful enough of them. I think the students and academics who've been pushing us to decolonize our curriculums, for example, doing vital work in this area. I think things are hopefully moving in a better direction from the one that I found, the position I found myself in when I was an undergraduate and I was a graduate student. It's very difficult for us as people who've come through a certain tradition to recognize how steeped in that tradition we are and how much we ourselves subject to these implicit biases and so on. So people should keep pushing and should keep pushing people on the end of the criticism. We have to kind of fight against the urge to be defensive and to say, no, the way that we're doing things is fine. The way that we're doing things is fine. So yes, I think that kind of work that Molly's doing is excellent. It won't suit everybody, but we should be really open to it.
Okay, thank you. So there are a lot of people who are very, very interested in this question about giving voice to individuals and groups who are excluded. And it's something that comes up in other areas as well. So I do work in global health.
Yeah.
And there are many conferences I've been to where speakers haven't even been able to get a visa to come to the conference. So this is one of the ways, I suppose, an unintended beneficial consequence of going online is at least no one has to get a visa in order to participate, which makes things a bit more inclusive. So we'll take one last question. We only have a couple of minutes, so if you could perhaps be as brief, I know you have been. This is from Taylor Lau. Do you think that refugees fleeing from their original countries and arriving at another place illegally can be framed as an act of civil disobedience, as it shows resistance to injustices and misfortunes?
I'm just going to read the question.
So question at the very bottom of the chat.
Okay.
Do you think that refugees fleeing from their original countries are engaging in civil disobedience?
Do I think that they're engaging in civil disobedience? Yeah, really, that's a really interesting and important question. I mean, I think the thing to bear in mind is that already within the international refugee regime, there is a demand that refugees should not be penalized for so-called illegal entry. That's recognized as part of the practice, part of the system, that part of the way in which the system encourages them to move. In order to be able to seek and enjoy asylum from persecution, people move, often to do it along clandestine routes. So in a way, framing it as civil disobedience goes one step too far, because in a sense that's already part of their entitlement within the given system. The problem is that people just don't seem to recognize it as such. So the whole idea is that refugees should not be penalized for that, and yet that's happening left, right, and center. But that is in contravention of the rules of the international refugee regime, which of course many of the states who penalize that are signatories to, are themselves trying to force other states to uphold, and so on.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to everyone who asked those questions, and my apologies to those whose questions didn't get asked, but all the questions will be sent on to Sarah for her consideration.